So it's my great pleasure to introduce our today's guest, Professor James Lamiell, who is a professor emeritus of Georgetown University. His contribution include personality psychology, history and philosophy of psychological thought, popularization of William Stern work, as we already discussed a couple of minutes ago. And also importantly, the topic of today's talk, particular problematic research practices in psychology, which concern statistical thinking and statistical methodology, which perhaps hinders us from building a deeper psychological understanding of individual, which has, of course, both epistemological and practical consequences. So I hope we are all ready, and Jim, I give the floor to you.
Okay, now let's see. We went through this yesterday, Julian, but let's see, I have to push first the share screen button, right? And then bring up my slides, correct?
Correct.
All right, let's do that. Are you able to see?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, so I think I just turned off the share screen. Share. Let's try this.
Yes, it is working.
You can see that.
Yes. Now let us
Okay.
start the presentation.
Okay, let's see. How's that?
Yes, all correct.
All right. And as I start, I noticed on my screen the names, there are blocks, there are several people whose names appeared alongside a few pictures. And so, of course, I don't know you people individually, but I'd like to say hi to all of you. And thank you very much for having me into your seminar. It's an honor to do this, and I'm very happy and very gratified by it. And I hope that what I have to say today will repay your time and effort in being here. So thank you again. The title of my presentation is Statisticism in Psychology. That's a word I made up. And you'll never find it in a dictionary, at least not yet. And it's a difficult word to pronounce, even for English speakers. And so I can well imagine that for native Polish speakers, it would be quite a challenge. But anyway, I hope to make clear to you as I go along why I use that word and what I think it refers to, and perhaps we can make some sense out of this. The subtitle gives a hint, of course. What is statisticism? And then how was it contracted, and can it be cured? So already the implication is that this is problematic, maybe on the order of a disease. And I think maybe psychology, mainstream psychology at least, has suffered from this malady or illness for quite some time. And I'll try to make clear why I think that it is problematic. Let's see. Now, if I can advance my slide, let's try that. Yeah, first of all, you would wonder, what is statisticism? And the best expression of it that I've ever seen comes from a book by an historian by the name of Henry Thomas Buckle, who was British. He lived from 1821 to 1862, so he died quite a young man, even by the standards of the 19th century. And in this book called The History of Civilization in England, there is a passage which says statistics, this is Buckle, statistics is a branch of knowledge which, though still in its infancy, has already thrown more light on the study of human nature than all the sciences put together. Now that's quite a bold claim, and Buckle was not shy. He went on to say, from carefully compiled statistical facts, more may be learned about the moral nature of man than can be gathered from all the accumulated experiences of the preceding ages. Again, this is quite an ambitious claim on Buckle's part. And I may exaggerate a little bit, I don't know, but as far as mainstream psychology is concerned, it seems to me that there is almost an unbounded faith in the power of statistical analyses to tell us truths about the psychological functioning, the psychological doing of human beings. And I think that, in fact, the way in which statistics is used in most of psychology is extremely limited in this regard. And I will try and explain to you today why I think this is so. First, of course, as a person interested in the history of psychology, I do want to take a brief look back to see where this faith in statistical thinking came from, how it arose. I want to give credit here to a contemporary writer, a social scientist by the name of Theodore Porter. I have drawn mightily on a book that he published in 1986 called The Rise of Statistical Thinking, 1820 to 1900. It's hard to imagine now, but there actually was a time when a discourse about human affairs was not so heavily guided by statistical thing. This is a way of thinking that began to surface early in the 19th century, 1820, and grew tremendously over the course of the years. One of the things that Buckle points out is that early on, the discipline that we now call statistics was known as political arithmetic. And I think that conveys very nicely what the keeping of numbers was about. It was about gathering data that could be used to inform political decisions, social policy and the like. And so in that sense, it really was political arithmetic. After a couple of decades, the term statistics was invented, and it referred really, it's open to question actually where that word statistics comes from. Why is this discipline that we're talking about called statistics? Well, one historical speculation is that it is rooted in the German word for the state, der Staat. And early on, statisticians were called statists, not statisticians, but statists. And that this, again, it's a continuation of the theme of political arithmetic. This is a discipline organized around the task of gaining numerical information that could be used to inform decision-making of an essentially political nature, the state. An early statistician of some renown was the Belgian scholar Adolphe Quetelet. Perhaps some of you have heard of Quetelet along the way. And Quetelet organized a discipline that he called social physics. And the centerpiece of social physics was his concept of l'homme moyen, pardon my French, or the average man. And Porter, in the book that I mentioned a few moments ago, discussed at some length the ideas of Quetelet. And in the course of that discussion, he wrote this is Porter writing about Quetelet. In principle, wrote Quetelet, the courage or criminality of a real person could be established if that person were placed in a great number of experimental situations and a record kept of the number of courageous or criminal acts elicited. I don't know how well this might, Joanna, map into time series analysis, but that's we're talking about, if you want to gain knowledge about an individual, in this case, that person's degree of criminality or courage, as the case may be, you do that by recording a large number of observations about that person. And you can then analyze those data. And if you do that sort of thing, knowledge about that person can be generated. Now, Porter went on to write, this would be interesting, but it was wholly unnecessary for social physics. Instead, the social physicist need only arrange that courageous and criminal acts be recorded throughout society, as they already were anyway, and then the average man could be assigned a penchant for crime equal to the number of criminal acts committed divided by the population, the number of people in the population. In this way, a set of discrete acts by distinct individuals could be transformed into what was a continuous magnitude, the penchant, which was an attribute of the average man. So if there are 20 people in the room of people to whom I am now speaking, and 2 of you have committed robbery, well, then each of you, or the average among you, would have a penchant of 0.1 toward committing that criminal act of robbery. Okay, but Quetelet understood that the average man was not a real person. It was a fictitious individual, a mathematical abstraction. Quetelet himself, now Porter here is quoting Quetelet himself in translation from the French, which is the language in which Quetelet was writing. If one seeks to establish in some way the basis of a social physics, it is he, l'homme moyen, whom one should consider, without disturbing oneself with particular cases or anomalies, and without studying whether some given individual can undergo a greater or lesser development in one of his faculties. So again, Quetelet understood very well the difference between the mathematical fiction of an average man and actual flesh and blood human beings. And Quetelet was of the view that individual behaviors, individual doings, dispositions, attitudes, what have you, were too capricious, too unorganized, too unpredictable to be understood scientifically. One had to go to a higher level of abstraction, namely the community, the population, the group, in order to find order sufficient on which to build a science. So effectively, Quetelet did not believe that there could be a scientific psychology. But Buckle, whom I introduced before, thought that he would reasonably be able to take thinking beyond the limits that Quetelet believed had to be established. Buckle wrote, statistical regularities of the sort uncovered by Quetelet. So Buckle was familiar with the works of Quetelet, are what we expect to find if the actions of man, i.e. humans, are governed by the state of the society in which they occur. While on the other hand, if we can find no such regularity, we may believe that their actions, and I put in here the actions of human beings, depend on some capricious and personal principle peculiar to each human, such as free will or the like. Well, that's exactly what Quetzalcoatl did believe. And Buckle here is beginning to defend a point of view in which, according to which, aggregate level regularity can be seen as a window onto individual level regularities. And this is a step that Quetzalcoatl was not willing to make, but Buckle was. And as this talk unfolds, I'm going to argue that essentially mainstream thinking in psychology lined up with Buckle. And that's really where statisticism comes from. Buckle. It becomes, therefore, in the highest degree important to ascertain whether or not there exists a regularity in the entire moral conduct of a given society. And this is precisely one of those questions for the decision of which statistics supply us with materials of immense value. Now, in about this time, again, we're talking about the 19th century. This is an image of a mathematician and philosopher named Moritz Wilhelm Drobisch, who, as it happens, was on the faculty at the University of Leipzig. He surely overlapped with Wilhelm Wundt, and I would be very surprised if Wundt and Drobisch did not know each other. I think they did, probably, very likely, although I have no exact record of there ever being a face-to-face meeting between the two. But Drobisch was aware of the ideas of Quetzalcoatl and Buckle and so on, and he issued this proclamation: "It is only through a great failure of understanding that the mathematical fiction of an average man can be elaborated as if all individuals possess a real part of whatever obtains for this average person." Now, again, as this talk goes on, I'm going to argue that it is just this great failure of understanding that was committed within mainstream psychology, and it prevails to this day. Is this screen, these pictures that I'm moving around of all the folks, is that on your screen as well? Or just when I move that, is that distracting? Because sometimes it covers up what I want to read.
Yes, we can see your pointer as well.
Okay, so I want to try to minimize the movement of that, but sometimes, as I say, it covers up what I'm trying to see. So in psychology, the great failure of understanding about which Drobisch warned is exactly what came to prevail. This is a poor image. You're probably going to have trouble reading this. This is the title page of a book that was published in 1979 by the fairly well-known research methodologist Fred Kerlinger. Anyone familiar with that name? He's written some research methods texts. Okay, well, this one is a relatively short book called Behavioral Research, a Conceptual Approach. So it's not filled with a lot of equations, but it's rather kind of giving an overall orientation. And Kerlinger wrote this about what he called a troublesome paradox. Let me see if I can put that down. Yeah. Psychological scientists must pay attention to that word. I'll come back to it. Hypothesize and test relations at the group level when they in fact often want to talk on the individual level. Psychological theories are intended as explanations of what goes on with a single individual. Indeed, it is virtually impossible to escape individual level talk in psychological research writing. So Kerlinger was always talking about research designs with which many of us are familiar, in which we're studying, for example, treatment groups. We assign subjects at random to one group versus another, and we take assessments and we do statistical calculations and base our conclusions on those statistical calculations. But Kurlinger is telling us that although we're doing these analyses at the group level or aggregate level, what we're trying to gain knowledge about is at the individual level. And the question is, how do we go conceptually, logically? How do you go from the aggregate level to the individual level? And Kurlinger really did not have an answer to the very question he posed. And so it remained for him what he called a troublesome paradox. So I mentioned before that Drobisch's colleague at Leipzig was Wilhelm Wundt, who was, as everyone I think knows, the founder of experimental psychology. And in the original experimental psychology, the quest was for knowledge of the general laws governing the mental life of individuals. Wundtian-style experiments were carried out on single subjects, one at a time. And the experiments were entirely self-contained. That is to say, the findings of the experiment were fully defined for individual subjects. And how could this serve as a quest for knowledge of general laws? Well, it has to do with the way in which the early experimentalists understood the term general. In German, we speak about, the term general was understood to mean allgemein, or common to all. That is to say, true of each one of the investigated individual cases. And I'm saying here transparently, one cannot establish generality in the sense understood by the original experimenters, except through the study of individuals. As David Bakken wrote in the mid-1950s, the general is manifested in the individual. If it's not allgemein, if it's not manifested in individual cases, then it's not general. This is something they had to do, the early experimentalists had to do, they could do, and they did do. A classic example of this, if you think about Ebbinghaus's studies of memory, and you know that Ebbinghaus not only was there a single subject in Ebbinghaus's experiments, but Ebbinghaus was that single subject. All the data that he reported on these memory studies were data that were gathered on Ebbinghaus himself. And although statistical analyses were implemented when Ebbinghaus analyzed his data, this was primarily for the purpose of estimating measurement error, not for the purpose of estimating population parameters. So those are two very different agendas. But this is why the estimation of demographic parameters, population level means, variances, and covariances, and null hypothesis statistical testing, none of this had any place in the original experimental psychology. So when in the quotation earlier of Kurlinger, he said the psychologist must function at the group level, this is a claim that would have struck Wundt and Ebbinghaus and the other early experimentalists as very peculiar. Kurlinger's troublesome paradox did not exist in the original experimental psychology because there was no studying at the group or aggregate level. It was all individual level. But as interest in an applied psychology grew, and applied psychology was a direction of inquiry for which Wundtian-style experimentation seemed poorly suited. And as a result, group-level experimentation came increasingly into favor over the first 30 years of the 20th century. As we know, in such experimentation, the statistical structure of experimental results defined for groups of subjects, the results of a t-test or an f-test, or the magnitude of a correlation between individual differences variables was the magnitude of those statistical results came to be regarded as a window onto the structure of relevant psychological processes operating on the individual level. This is very much the way Buckle would have had it. And it was once this view became established within mainstream psychology, as I write here, that's when Kerlinger's paradox was born. Again, it did not exist for the Wundtian style experimenters because they weren't doing group level analyses. They were interested in theorizing about individuals, and they knew that in order to do that properly, you had to study individuals. There was no substitute for that. Now, as far as applied psychology is concerned, a seminal development here was the founding of differential psychology, or the study of individual and group differences. And William Stern was a key figure in this. This book on the psychology of individual differences toward a differential psychology was his first venture into that domain, at least publicly. And that book was published in 1900. By the way, I should mention that I'm collaborating with a colleague now in France by the name of Serge Nicholas, and due mostly to Serge's efforts, somewhat to mine, we're soon to publish an English translation of this book by Stern, the 1900 book. So if the publisher approves, we should be that book should be appearing, say, within a year or so, for those of you who may be interested. That book was a relatively short book. It was followed up in 1911 with a book called The Foundations of Differential Psychology, which is a much more extensive treatment of the subject matter that was of interest to Stern there, the study of individual differences. On this effort, Stern's contemporary colleague and countryman, Hugo Münsterberg, wrote, "The study of individual differences is not itself applied psychology, but it is the presupposition without which applied psychology would have remained a phantom. For as long as experimental psychology remained essentially a study of the mental laws common to all, allgemein, human beings, an adjustment to the practical demands of daily life could hardly come into question. With such general laws, allgemeine Gesetze, we could never have mastered the concrete situations of society because we should have had to leave out of view the fact that there are gifted and ungifted, intelligent and stupid, sensitive and obtuse, quick and slow, energetic and weak individuals." So Münsterberg here is tipping his hat, so to speak, to Stern for founding differential psychology, which opened up possibilities for a genuinely applied psychology, psychotechnics, psychological testing, and the like. And of course, those fields blossomed once the methods of differential psychology were learned and propagated. Stern himself wrote, "Differential psychology is concerned not with the general laws of psychological life themselves," that was the business of Wundt's general psychology, "but rather with the differential manifestations of those general laws across age, sex, race, and peoples, as well as across temperament types, character types, levels of ability, and intelligence." So Stern saw the general psychology and differential psychology as two distinct subfields, complementary, but nevertheless different in their knowledge objectives and aims. In the 1911 book, Stern again emphasized that the knowledge objectives of the differential psychology were other than those of the general psychology. And in this context, he noted explicitly that population level knowledge of the statistical relationships between variables in terms of which individuals have been differentiated is not individual level knowledge of the persons who have been differentiated in terms of those variables. That distinction was made very clearly in Stern's 1911 book and would, over the ensuing years, become blurred to the point of obliteration. So we pose the question here. This is a scatter plot. It's hypothetical data that I made up so I could do some calculations and so on. And it plots the points of relationship between two individual differences variables. And there are 27 data points on that plot. And the actual correlation that I computed for those data was R equals 0.76. And the question is, for what entity is the research finding R equals 0.76 an empirical fact? That research finding is an empirical fact about the population within which that finding has been made. It is not an empirical fact about any of the individuals within that population. It is quite literally an empirical fact about no one. That's a startling claim sometimes. At least I have startled previous audiences with my statement to that effect, but that's really the case. The aggregate level knowledge it's not an empirical fact somehow about all of the people that are in that plot. It's actually an empirical fact about none of them. And the same holds for statistical comparisons of groups. For example, I made up some data here again, comparing boys and girls on scores on a hypothetical spelling test or whatever. I can't even remember the details of the example now, and the boxes enclose group means. The mean for boys there, and the mean for the girls, and then the individual data points for girls around the mean, same as is true of boys. And you can express these data in correlational terms, not just t-test terms, although a t-test might be the most conventional way to look statistically at the difference between those means. But if you do the analysis in computations of Pearson product moment correlation, it turns out to be 0.45. And again, that relationship is a relationship for the population of subjects who have been studied. It is not an empirical fact about any one of those kids. Now, perhaps one of the most prominent differential psychologists in the 20th century was Anne Anastasi, who wrote a textbook on differential psychology that went to like 7 editions. It was very widely read, very informative for generations of students. And I know that Anastasi, she wrote a foreword to a 1995 facsimile edition of Stern's 1911 book, in which she tributed William Stern with having influenced her very much in the course of her development as a differential psychologist. And nevertheless, Anastasi wrote this: differential psychology is not a separate field of psychology. Its fundamental questions are no different from those of general psychology. This is in direct contradiction to the quotation of Stern that I read you a few moments ago. Stern pointed out that the fundamental questions of the two subfields are indeed quite different. Anastasi here is saying, no, it is apparent that if we can explain why individuals react differently from one another, we shall understand why each individual reacts as he does. Again, we can take the aggregate level findings and use them as informative about what's going on at the level of the individual. So a watershed development actually in experimental psychology was indeed the movement from the statistical comparisons of natural groups, which is the way in which differential psychology began, to the statistical comparison of treatment groups. And in this slide, in the image on the right, I talk about treatment groups there and talk hypothetical method 1 versus method 2 of teaching spelling to 4th grade children. The data that I plot there are identical to the data in the natural groups comparison. And I did that for a reason, to show simply that the only difference between these two data arrays is whether boys and girls, the subjects have been divided according to the natural grouping of what gender they are, or whether they have been divided according to random assignment to two different teaching methods. In other respects, these two data arrays are exactly the same, and the statistical methods used to analyze those data are exactly the same. And when that happened, it then became possible for Lee J. Cronbach to plead for a merger of the two, what he called the two disciplines of scientific psychology. This is this facsimile of the front page of Cronbach's 1956 presidential address to the APA, which was published in The American Psychologist in 1957 under the title, The Two Disciplines of Scientific Psychology. It's a very famous piece. I suspect many in the audience today are familiar with this piece. In it, Cronbach called for a merger of scientific psychology's two disciplines, the correlational and the, which is a non-experimental form of investigation, and experimental. But Cronbach in that piece is not talking about Wundtian style experimentation. He's talking about treatment group experimentation. And that's the only way. It was only after psychology had gone to treatment group experimentation that a merger of that approach with correlational methods would even be possible. There is no way to merge correlational investigation with Wundtian style experimentation on single subjects. It's not possible to do. But once experimentation in psychology had become treatment group experimentation, such a merger was possible. And it was that the suggestion by Cronbach that we begin to think in terms of designing studies that would include both kinds of variables was greeted very enthusiastically and continues widely to this day. Example. Let's suppose that we had this experimental approach. We randomly assigned subjects to one of two methods for teaching spelling to 4th grade children. And the average value of the students, pupils assigned to method 1 is here, and the average value for method 2 is here. Now, theoretically, the way these data would be interpreted, often just implicitly, is that there's something about teaching method 1, which is driving the performance of students exposed to that method below the overall mean, and something about teaching method 2 that is driving the performance of the students exposed to that method above the treatment group mean. And again, we can analyze these data, and I made up some data, and it turns out that expressed in correlational terms, that relationship that you see plotted there is equivalent to a correlation of 0.45 between teaching method and performance on the criterion spelling test. So if the correlation is 0.45, the R square, or percent variance accounted for, works out to 0.2. But of course, individual pupils within each group vary somewhat around the respective group means. This is not seen as evidence that teaching method 1 did not exert the same effect on all the subjects exposed to that teaching method. On the contrary, the assumption is whatever the effect of teaching method 1 is, it exerted that effect on all 10 subjects exposed to that method. And same in method 2, the effect is the same on all the 10 subjects exposed to that method. And the fact that all 10 subjects within each method do not perform identically is only to be interpreted as evidence that there were other factors in addition to teaching method 1, not instead of, but in addition to teaching method 1, that would have driven performance of individual subjects above the mean or below the mean, as the case may be. Well, what might those other factors have been? Well, suppose we entertained the possibility that girls would perform differently from boys. So we we expand the design now. And so within teaching method 1, we can compute a mean for girls and we can compute a mean for boys. Same over in teaching method 2, a mean for girls, a mean for boys. And we can analyze those data taking into account the factors teaching method, which is an experimental treatment, and a correlational variable, girls and boys. And now, so we have the B is the slope for TM, teaching method, plus the slope, the regression equation now for gender. And now, of course, you have a teaching method by gender interaction. So now your new regression equation has 3 terms, not just one: teaching method, gender, teaching method by gender interactions. A reanalysis of the data yields a multiple correlation of 0.74, which raises the percent variance accounted for to 0.55. But now again, we see still, if you look at these purple arrows, even among girls exposed to teaching method 1, there are still differences. Same among boys exposed to teaching method 1, girls to teaching method 2, and boys to teaching method 2. Well, what might account for those differences? Well, let's entertain the variable achievement motivation. So now we can rewrite the regression equation. We'll now have a term, once again, for teaching method, for gender, for teaching method by gender, and now another term yet, a 4th term for achievement motivation. We can now reanalyze the data. The multiple correlation jumps up to 0.91, which most psychological researchers would be very happy to have. And R squared now equals 0.83. So the question arises, does knowledge of the statistical covariation between some predictor variable or variables and a criterion variable enable the prediction and hence explanation of individual behavior? Well, the presumption is in mainstream thinking that the answer to that question, of course, is yes. Let's look at this. First of all, we understand that individual predictive error is understood as a given person's actual criterion score minus the predicted criterion score for that person. So this Y prime is generated by a regression equation, and that's a prediction or postdiction, as the case may be, as it is in fact anyway, of how that subject would perform. And this is how the subject actually turns out to have performed. And the error values now in this table over here in column A are based on the one predictor equation that I introduced a few moments ago. That is to say, we're going to predict scores, Y prime, just on the basis of the teaching method to which a given pupil was exposed. Correlation is 0.45, as we saw before. The R squared value is 0.2, and that means that error variance is 0.8. So 20% of the variance accounted for, 80% of the variance remains unexplained. Okay. What about when we add gender? So now again, we have 3 predictor variables: teaching method, gender, and the teaching method by gender interaction. The multiple correlation has jumped to 0.74. R square is 0.55, which leaves unexplained variance at 0.45. These numbers will always add up, of course. You can see that the residual variation has gone down. Error variance has gone down. And here are the actual errors of prediction for individual pupils. Third step, we're going to go to the next regression equation, which has 4 terms: teaching method, gender, teaching method by gender, achievement motivation. R is 0.91. R square is up now to 0.83, leaving 17% of the variance unaccounted for. And here are the errors of prediction for individual pupils. Once again, predictive error variation has declined from the first to the second to the third case, as makes sense. That does make sense. And the question is, as our theory and measurement get continually better, the errors of prediction will approach 0 for each individual. This is a quotation from an article by Dar and Serlin, in which they kind of were objecting to my analysis of this sort. And the question is that really true? Is it true that as our theory and measurement get continually better, errors of prediction will approach 0 for each individual? Can predictive error at the individual level be presumed to decline toward 0 as aggregate predictive error, predictive accuracy, or explanatory power increases? Let's have a look. Look at person 1. Predictive error, in the case of the first equation, 3.6. Absolute value is what matters here. It just indicates how far off prediction is from actuality. For the second equation, predictive error drops to 1.2. And for the third equation, it drops to 0.95. So for person number 1, pupil number 1, that the progression here seems to be what we would expect. What about for pupil number 2? As it turns out, if you look across the 3 errors of prediction, the best prediction in the case of pupil 2 is realized with the statistically weakest equation. From the first equation to the second equation, predictive error actually jumps for pupil number 2, even though error variance has declined. And goes slightly back down then for for the third equation. And if you look across, if you look at these data, what you find is the answer to the question varies from one pupil to the next. Sometimes predictive error does steadily decrease. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it goes up and then back down. And there are a couple of places in here where, for example, for pupil 11, the best prediction is realized for the statistically worst equation. And so there is no blanket answer to the question about predictive error decreasing or increasing in accordance with these equations. It depends on the individual case. This is actually consistent with a view that was addressed actually by the logician John Venn, who's famous for his so-called Venn diagrams, which you may be familiar with, where oftentimes I'm told, well, Lamiell, we're talking about probabilities here. And as the statistical relationships get better and better, the probabilities get higher and higher concerning the accuracy of a prediction. Venn addressed himself to the question of probability in a very interesting way. And the quotation in the red box, which I'm sure you cannot see there, is what I have up in the box at the top. It says, "So careful of the type she seems, so careless of the single life." Venn says, Let's look at the simple example of a coin toss. He says, I am about to toss a coin up, and I therefore half believe, to adopt the current language, that it will turn up heads. Now, it seems to be overlooked that if we appeal to the event, our belief must inevitably be wrong. For the thing must either happen or not happen. There is no third alternative. But whichever way it occurs, our half belief, so far as such a state of mind admits of interpretation, must be wrong. If heads occurs, I am wrong in not having expected it enough, for I only half believed in its occurrence. If it does not happen, I am equally wrong in having expected it too much, for I half believed in its occurrence when in fact it did not occur at all. This is the punchline. The same conceptual difficulty will occur in every case in which we attempt to justify our state of partial belief, call it probability, in a single contingent event. The event will either, at the individual level, will either happen or it will not. And this is why we come right back to Drobish's claim. It is only through a great failure of understanding that the mathematical fiction of an average or aggregate man can be elaborated as if all individuals possess a real part of whatever obtains for this aggregate person. So let me draw its conclusion, and then perhaps we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Predictive and explanatory knowledge claims of the sort widely endorsed by practitioners of the contemporary methodological canon of psychological science all suffer from the great failure of understanding identified by Drobish. Widespread recognition of the difference in knowledge objectives between psychology and what I have come to call a psychodemography is long overdue. For the purposes of a genuine psychological science, there are many methodological options, both qualitative and quantitative, already out there, waiting to be adopted. In the meantime, I would say, beware statisticism.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for extremely interesting talk. Also for the thorough treatment of the history here, because without this historical context of the development of a discipline, yeah, we cannot so clearly identify the problem. So I open the floor for questions, comments, and for discussion. We have just a couple of people here in the room, but also a lot of people joining on Zoom. You can ask your questions by raising your hand in Zoom.
Can you identify those people, Julian? Because I don't think I can see them.
Oh, yeah, I will. When we have a question, I can.
Okay. Okay. I've lost I have a picture of you and Joanna and myself, and I can't find the rest of us. Oh, there we go.
Perhaps stop sharing the screen. That would be
Stop sharing the screen. Okay. Let's see. Stop share. How's that? There we go. Yeah.
We see each other.
So maybe we can wait for the questions from the audience. Just as a warm up, I can ask one of from myself. Yeah. So at the very end, in the last slide,
Yeah.
You mentioned qualitative and quantitative methods, which you claim are already ready to be adopted instead of statistical, let's say, problematic statistical practices. Could you just elaborate, maybe give us a few pointers where to look for those, and what is the relation of qualitative thinking to the topic of your talk?
Well, I think most directly the relationship is that if we want to gain knowledge of individuals, of persons, we have to study individuals. And then the question becomes, how are you going to do that? Stern himself, even in the differential psychology text, was very insistent that the methods of differential psychology, or quantitative methods generally, should not be thought of as in some way making unnecessary qualitative inquiry, that the qualitative inquiry is always necessary. And he was very wary of people becoming so enamored of their quantitative methods that they would abandon qualitative methods altogether. One qualitative method that he explicitly advocated was biography. And there are people out there now who are very interested in doing biographical studies as a way of gaining knowledge about individuals. Of course, biographies have been around for a long time, but they have not been methods widely employed by psychologists. And there are people out there now who are embracing such methods. There's a whole subdiscipline in the field now being talked about as narrative psychology. I don't know if that is a concept that's familiar to, there's a fellow by the name of Brian Schiff, who's actually at the American University of Paris. And he's been doing a lot of work in narrative psychology. So his work is one of many sources that could provide a good example of what I would call qualitative methods that can be used very importantly to advance psychological theory. I don't know, you referred to your seminar as a quali-quanti seminar, Julian, and what examples of qualitative methods are favored among your folks there?
What kind of qualitative methods we favor? We do interviews.
Interviews?
We try to apply the principles of explication interviews, which are inspired phenomenologically.
Yeah.
Also, we do some observational studies based on video recordings when we try to develop categories to code behaviors.
Yeah.
But,
Go ahead.
But also, I think it's important with what kind of quantitative methods we couple such observations, because this quali-quanti is a sort of attempt to have the both of this, best of the two worlds.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the previous seminars also that I recommend very much is Hasselmann's seminar. Just a moment. Fred Hasselmann's seminar. He talked about very dense time series that come from one person, which are then the basis for sort of trying to grasp some general principles of when a state can change of a person, for example, but not ascribing exactly some content, right, based on that. And we think that this is probably the way to go.
Yes, yeah, I would fully agree. A couple of comments that I would make here. First of all, this is not intended, my view is not intended as a blanket indictment of statistical methods or quantitative methods generally. It's a question of aggregate versus individual. And I do believe, and I have done some work myself, geez, back in the 80s, of a pretty quantitative nature involving studies of single subjects. And the idea is very much along the lines that I think you just said, Johanna, which is maybe where you find generality is in some kind of process. For example, some shift and not necessarily in the content of it. And so that strikes me as all to the good. And we can, you know, even in the early experiments, there was much use made of quantitative methods. Ebbinghaus certainly tried to quantify a great deal of what he was doing in his studies of memory. You have psychophysics, which Fexnerian psychophysics, if you go way back, very quantitative, and we're looking for generalities in certain features of the quantitative findings, not necessarily in terms of the content for different subjects. Another a more quantitative approach that I think has great promise has been a colleague here in the States by the name of James Grice, who's at Oklahoma State University, has been working out a system that he calls observational oriented method, OOM. And if you look at Grice's work, and he's published quite a bit. I say he's a contemporary. He's younger than I am, and it's an attempt to conduct inquiry of a quantitative nature, but he's very sensitive to the importance of testing hypotheses at the level of individual subjects. Mm. And so, if you really kind of would prefer a more quantitative approach to doing research, and you're looking around for methods that might be viable in that regard, I would very much encourage that you look up the writings of James Grice, Grice. He's at Oklahoma State University. And hey, you might want to have him come on Zoom and do a seminar for you. He's terrific. He really is. So that's part of what I meant in my perhaps kind of puzzling remark toward the end, that there are both qualitative and quantitative methods out there that are available. They're now available. It's not like we have to invent these things altogether, and that they can be put to good use. In some of my own research that I just mentioned a couple of moments ago that I was doing back in the 80s, I was interested in really trying to develop a mathematical model of the process by which subjects make subjective judgments of their own and one another's personality characteristics. What is the nature of the judgment process by which a person decides that someone is highly gregarious and rates that person as highly gregarious? And I did a lot of research on that. It's pretty quantitative in nature, and I would theoretically speaking, I would try to develop mathematical or arithmetic models. There was not high-level mathematics, arithmetic models of two different judgment processes. apply those models to the input information that I was giving subjects and generating predictions. Well, if they're thinking in accordance with this model, these should be the ratings they make. On the other hand, if they're thinking in accordance with this model, these should be the ratings they make. And then I have them make the ratings, and I then analyze the data by seeing the extent to which the ratings that the subject actually makes conform to predictions based on one model versus predictions based on the other model. And on that basis, make an argument that the data indicate that the subjects are thinking more in terms of this model than in terms of that model. It's all done at the level of the individual subject. And I would examine, I would study maybe 40 subjects or 30 subjects in a given experiment, but the experiment is all carried out at the level of the individual, and the experimental findings are defined for individuals. You know, this is often a stumbling block when I speak to contemporaries. They say, well, you know, I design my experiments, I bring my subjects into the laboratory and test them one at a time, which is true. But the findings of their research are not defined by the results of subjects one at a time. The findings of the research are not settled until all the subjects have been tested and the data are aggregated. So yes, they expose individual subjects to the experiment, but the findings of individual subjects are not what define the outcome of experiments. And that's what the difference is. In the original Wundtian experimentation, the results for individual subjects defined the findings for that experiment. And you establish generality to the extent that it can be established by seeing if you're getting the same pattern of findings in case after individual case. This is doable. It's doable. And one final point on this question, back to a remark by Julian. I think you used the expression direct observation in talking about part of how you study your subject. This is an expression that Stern used repeatedly as a contrast to quantitative methods. And he says there is no substitute, regardless of the sophisticated level of the quantitative methods that you use, there is no substitute for direct observation of your subjects. The body language that they have in responding to questions and so on. This is always a part of the research enterprise. And so I was struck by the fact that the words I heard you say, Julian, reminded me of exact words that William Stern has used. By the way, I think it's listed in my Vita, but you might not know. I just, after this book that Julian read on research methods, I did a book that came out 2 years later called Uncovering Critical Personalism. And of the 10 chapters in that book, 7.5 are made up of my translations of original writings by William Stern. And you may, if you're interested in Stern, you may be interested to look into some. Of course, many of you may read German. I don't know that. Here in the States, not many of my colleagues do, but I just thought I'd mention that if you're interested in looking into some of Stern's works and aren't equipped to look at the original German, which of course would always be preferable, but there is that book of mine that presents a few of his writings that I thought were particularly informative and might be helpful in that regard. Yeah.
Yes, so just to maybe complement a little bit the direct observation and how we try to forge some maybe, I don't know, novel qualitative also approaches, is that we also think that the first person experience is something that needs to be studied, and the second person experience, which is the experience of a person, within the contact with the other. So these are very, very important too. But one thing that you said was really very, very also pertinent to our discussion today. In the previous talk, we asked one of the questions to a personality psychologist about the measurement, and your studies seem to be exactly about how to measure something like a trait or personality trait, that it may conform to different models even within one individual. And then we make, huge aggregate sort of correlational models, and then how to even go at the level of intervention, any intervention, or on the individual level or on the aggregate even, maybe, I don't know, creating some conditions, learning, I don't know, setting up a classroom, for example. But how to, in general, we have several clinical psychologists here among us, and that is a question that is really bothering me and nagging me. Is it really possible to use those, personality theories in your work, or you really go by some sort of general principles of creating favorable condition to be with the person and help them? This is something that nags me.
Right. I'm not a clinician, and I've never been a clinician, so I don't have any direct first-hand knowledge of, making clinical type interventions in people's lives. But without question, such interventions and other kinds of interventions made on the basis of testing and so on, they raise moral questions, ethical questions. It's not just an epistemic matter of you can logically make these interpretations or you cannot logically make these interpretations. When you're not only making interpretations, but basing interventions in people's lives on the basis of those interventions, you've entered into the moral or ethical domain. It's not just a question of being right or wrong. And I don't have any fast solutions for you, but certainly it is an issue that bears real careful consideration. Somewhere in this book, for example, I wrote about some efforts more recently in the domain of research-based interventions or research-based treatments, and how it is the case that some have really tried to defend the position that treatment, therapeutic methods that turn out best according to research studies, which are essentially of a randomized treatment group design, are the only ones that should be available to people or eligible for insurance coverage and things of that sort. And when you realize that the fallacies in basing decisions like this on the basis on probabilistic findings, you realize that you're dealing in morally troublesome territory here, and I do write a little bit about that in this book in one of the latter chapters. So yeah, that's what I'd say. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the Zoom audience? From the room? Okay, maybe you can come closer.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you for a wonderful overview, especially the discussion of qualitative and quantitative methods that Julian mentioned is among us for a couple of times. But I wanted to ask you, in the words of the scholars you cited, or in your own view, how you would understand what's the measurement? Because, you know, in that, because that's what the did, for example, the two types of psychologists that you described, did they understood what the measurement is, what the observation is, and what the experience is, those three notions? Because for me, it seems that the measurement and quantification of everything is very much among those statistician type psychologists, while qualitative researchers do not care so much about quantification, about and etc., but rather about direct observation that you mentioned and experiencing the phenomena directly. That's the like what you asked about the experience. I don't know that you heard me well. If you could just, if you don't understand something, you could say it again, just by the type of how I'm speaking.
Yeah, I'm having trouble with the sound quality. So if maybe I could get.
Maybe.
Yes, but the question was about the sort of focus of the psychologists that use mainly statistical methods. They need to focus on measurement, the process of measurement, while the qualitative psychologists more can focus on that direct observation, which is it a measurement too, or is it more connected to experience? I think I'm elaborating a little bit, Konrad, but a very nice question indeed. So
yes.
Can you comment on this difference between, you used another term, measurement, experience, and observation. Okay.
Well, in one of the chapters in a book that I co-edited with Kate Slaney in 2020, I think Julian mentioned it in the introduction. There is a contribution there in which the argument is developed that quantitative methods are always based on qualitative considerations. So the root of all observation, even when it's transformed into quantitative measurements, the root of that conceptually is considerations of an essentially qualitative nature. Quantitative emerges from qualitative. Secondly, I would say that is anyone familiar with the name Joel Michel? He's an Australian. He's written a lot about this problem of measurement and the way in which mainstream psychologists think about measurement and what they call their measures. And he's very informative on the question of measurement. My own work, as you know, has not been focused so much on measurement, but on the statistical analysis of data once the measurements have already been made. So I'm afraid I don't have anything that I would consider horribly insightful to say about the question of measurement, but I would encourage, if you're not familiar with the writings of Joel Michel, he's a contemporary, Michell, Joel is his first name, Joel. He's written some really very, very good stuff on the question of measurement. I'm sorry?
Thank you so much. And I was just wondering how your notion of statisticism goes with because what you said was actually the same argument that the Mark Linker did at our Wally conference and his process ontology. And I wonder how your approach to psychology goes with Mark Linker's approach.
Yes, Mark Bickert refers to this as a tragedy of operationalism and of not being able to really operationalize a person. And do you know his work? And
I don't. I probably should, huh? Yeah. What's the name again?
that's Mark Bickhardt. I think he's editor-in-chief of New Ideas in Psychology.
Oh, Bickhardt. Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, I know the name. I can't say that I'm familiar with this work, but I do know the name. Yes. Yes.
So Mark is now working on a huge book, which is already 1,400 pages, and it's going to have a title "The Whole Person."
Oh, yes.
And I think he would be very, very, very in favor of what you are saying. I think some of the arguments are really very.
I think so too. You know, for a while he was a co-editor or co-associate editor of New Ideas with a scholar by the name of Jack Martin at Simon Fraser University. And so I'm kind of familiar a little bit with Bickhardt because I've developed a kind of a close relationship with Jack Martin. In fact, he was on the editorial staff of the Palgrave Macmillan series in History and Theory, and he's the one who first approached me about doing this book. And I know that he would have discussed these ideas with Bickhardt. And so while I don't know Bickhardt directly, personally myself, I'm kind of indirectly familiar with him through Jack Martin.
Yeah, if I was to recommend just one short paper, I think this would be this, what is the title, 2017, I think. How to operationalize a person. Thank you.
How to operation. Oh, this is Bickhardt, you say?
Bickhardt's paper.
Yeah, yeah, okay. That sounds like a delicious title.
Or maybe how not to operationalize it would be better, but okay. So I don't know, maybe okay.
Yeah, we still have room if, for questions. Some people are leaving because it's getting late in our time zone.
Yeah.
Really past the normal working hours.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I was I was just wondering myself because I think most of what we discussed today concerned the level of individual and of course individual psychology, and psychology as a discipline was conceived to study individuals. What we are doing in our research in this group often concerns not so much the level of individual, but the level of the interaction,
right,
between individuals.
Yeah.
And while I think most of the problems translate to interaction as well. It's just another level of analysis, but as long as you do it in a kind of treatment groups experimentation, the problems are all the same. But do you feel there is, for instance, when you are designing a treatment group experiment, you are learning something about the population, right? Would you say that the knowledge that you gain is let's say, the true knowledge about the intervention that you perform, even if it's not anymore a knowledge about the individual subject under this intervention?
Yes, I would say that, and I'm glad you brought up that question, because I should always remember to mention this point, and oftentimes I forget that what I call psychodemographic knowledge, or knowledge of populations, and that's what demography is. Demography is the study of populations, and Most of what we're generating now in psychology is knowledge of populations, and that's why I call it psychodemography. And there is no hope for psychodemography as an avenue toward advancing our understanding of individuals. However, and what I haven't emphasized but need to, and your question forces me to do that, Julian, is to say that psychodemography, the knowledge of psychodemography can be and is very valuable. There are questions that we would like to answer at the level of populations, certainly in the formulation of public policy, for example. And I think it's in one of the chapters of my book, chapter 7, maybe, I can't remember, where I try to use an example of that by former colleagues at Georgetown who were studying the efficacy of Head Start programs in public school facilities in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they did beautiful research. And the question is, if you include within the curriculum of preschool children certain instructions, can these instructional methods prove to have a positive effect on the development of children? Now, they are not able to answer that question at the level of the individual children, but as a basis for designing curriculum materials for preschool children, the results of these studies can be very informative. If you want to have this sort of outcome, this is the sort of thing you might consider to be doing. So by no means do I need to say that the knowledge of a psychodemographic sort is useless for all conceivable purposes. I don't think that, and I think that would be really irresponsible to say. It's just that it's not also knowledge of what's going on with individual children. And that is a question that's of importance in psychological theory. You've touched upon another question, the kind of the social or interpersonal. Someone before me, and I have to do some more looking to track it down, used the expression critical interpersonalism. And I'm working on a book right now, actually, in which I'm bringing critical personalistic insights, I believe, to a discussion of the problem of race relations in the United States. I have been, since the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020, I have been participating with 9 other people, 5 Black, 5 white, in discussion groups in our community devoted to consideration of racial issues in the United States. There's a long history of that here, as you very well know. And I have been struck through a lot of our readings, and we read a lot of material about the way in which the language reflects an impersonal way of thinking that focuses not on persons, but on person kinds. Black people, white people, males, females, et cetera, et cetera. And I believe that the social, cultural ethos of our communities would be enhanced by adopting a critically personalistic perspective, which would mean, in this context, a critically interpersonal perspective. And so, in effect, it's an attempt to bring the discussion to the interpersonal or social level, and not keep it strictly at the individual level. So social, to me, means interpersonal, And I don't know how one could have a successful understanding of interpersonal relationships without a successful understanding of the personal. The interpersonal assumes it involves the personal. So there's an intimate connection there that I don't think can be broken off. And I hope to bring that idea to the fore in this work that I'm currently doing, and how it would apply to discussions of, and therefore thinking about, the problem of race relations in the United States.
Thank you. We are looking forward to it. Konrad, did you?
Yes, I wanted to also refer to the Head Start program that you mentioned, and it is especially interesting for me that you mentioned the psychodemographic measurements of Head Start, especially that because, as far as I know, it was also started by ecological psychologists, the Prof and Brenner, who would really probably follow up with your line of argumentation today against psychodemographic psychology. So it really struck me that this program is actually, verified with these measures. And it would not have been even started if only these measures would be applied, and not the measures that actually focus on the person, the context, and the process that those people are functioning in.
Yeah.
So they were made within as kind of within this individual approach to the person, and they were implemented. Now they are evaluated within this psychodemographic level. So this kind of zooming in and zooming out in this program really shows it very well how this goes together as well.
Yes, indeed. I think so. It goes to the person. Again, I don't know how one would separate the personal from the interpersonal. I don't know if that addresses your comment.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's also a shift in values, right? So because behind developing this Head Start program, there were some values, right? So it was motivated by, as far as I understand, the ecological insights, and then when we evaluate this program using demographic statistics, we are shifting the values as well, right? Because now we are concerned not with the, let's say, benefit of an individual, but maybe a benefit of a society, benefit of the education system.
Yeah, exactly so. And so, yeah, the discussion will inevitably end up touching on questions of value. That was fundamental to Stern's ideas of the person. Persons are continuously evaluating the circumstances of their lives, their surrounding, and so on. And that's just an inherent characteristic of persons. And so we're never going to be too far from questions of value. And yeah.
Okay.
Somehow still not a good account of value in psychology. That's amazing that such a central, absolutely central concept is sort of evaded or avoided.
The concept of value?
Yes.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Another immeasurable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that
it's time to close.
it was a great lecture, James. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I appreciate it, and who knows where this might lead, but please, if you can share, if people don't have it already, my email address, Julian, so that anyone who might wish to contact me, maybe about questions or whatever that come up later, I welcome the opportunity to correspond.
Thank you very much. We are also honored to have you here. And of course, if any time the opportunity come for you to visit Warsaw, you are very much welcome here. And I'm sure that there's still a lot to discuss regarding
Always.
common,
Yes.
common interest also in William Stern. And
Yes. Indeed.
Yes, really eye-opening and sort of strengthening our kind of discord with some of the common practices, which is really very valuable. Thank you.
That's very gratifying for me to hear. And again, I'm thankful. And it's just from this little contact today, I have the sense that yours is a very intellectually vibrant and warm, friendly community. And I would just love to have the opportunity to actually be among you someday. And maybe that happens.
Yes, in person. And in the meantime, we will definitely add your name to the information about the seminars, because probably we will have guests recommended by you. Sometimes Mark Bighart visits us, so we are very much looking forward to seeing you again.
Well, thank you again. I'm very happy to have been able to do this.
Okay.
thank you very much. So this concludes the meeting. Goodbye.
Okay. Sleep well.
Thank
Goodbye.
you, everybody, for staying.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.